Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. I have a really exciting interview. I'm joined by Dr. Cosimo Posth of the University of Tübingen and the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And he is the author, or one of the co-authors, behind a 2016 paper, The Genetic History of Ice Age Europe. And we're going to talk about how modern Europeans relate to the first inhabitants of the continent, the first Homo sapiens who entered the continent some 45,000 years ago-ish. And what did they look like, and what else do we know about them through the study of genetics, which is not my forte, so I'm absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Posth with me. Thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting, Stefan.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a simple question, but I suspect it has a very complicated answer. Are modern Europeans related to the inhabitants of the continent in what we call the Aurignacian period, 40,000 years ago, approximately?
Yeah, the preliminary data that we have available so far would speak in favor. So we speak indeed in a certain level of genetic continuity between 40,000 down to today. There are so far only three genome published that are predating 40,000. It's a genome from Siberia. It's called Ustishim, dated around 45,000 years ago. A genome from Romania, dated to around 40 to 42,000 years ago. And another one from China called Tianyuan, that is dated to also 42,000 years ago. And all these three individuals um, are differentially related to present day individuals. So what we observe for the one living from found in Siberia, Ustishim, as well as the one found in Europe called Oase 1, they do not contribute genetic ancestry to later European populations. On the contrary, the individual from China 42,000 years ago does contribute genetic ancestry to later East Asians. So we find a different picture between East and West Eurasia. But your question was more like what happens in Europe, what happens, for example, from the Aurignacian onwards. And this is, of course, we have little data still from this from individual associated to this material culture, so-called also technocomplex, Aurignacian technocomplex. But what it emerged so far is that at least from 37,000 years ago, so from the oldest genome associated with this culture, called Kostienki, we find a genetic continuity with modern day Europeans. So it doesn't mean that there is a direct link, there is a direct 100% continuity, but there is at least a portion of the genome present in this individual from 37,000 years ago that survived through time until today.
So we're really looking at a very tiny percentage of modern Europeans' DNA is related to some people that lived 37,000 years ago.
Exactly. We have also other individuals that are, of course, from the same technocomplex or Ignatian, in particularly one individual from Belgium called Goyer, from the Goyer cave. And also in that case, we find a clear signal of, yeah, some genetic, distinctive genetic affinity with modern day Europeans. The proportion is not high. It's kind of hard to estimate with great details, and it also varies, of course, between population and population in Europe. But in general, it's a value that it's, I would say, below 10%.
So a very small percentage of our DNA. So let me just double check I've got the picture right. There are older specimens from 40,000 years ago that Europeans have no genetic continuity with. East Asians do have some genetic continuity with people from 40,000 years ago. And from 37,000 years ago, a very small percentage of our DNA is related to those people.
Exactly, yes, but still a small percentage, but still significant enough to form our genetic makeup.
Interesting. How does this relate to recent studies in genetics connected to the Neolithic and the Bronze Age Europe, which are which were seemingly spread by a migration of people as well. The Neolithic from Anatolia and the Aegean, and the Bronze Age from perhaps the region around Russia and Ukraine. Are those regions are, th- are they sort of from the same source population? I don't know if that's like an intelligent question or not, but because the regions are so closely related, I imagine that you know Europeans in Russia, as they spread the Bronze Age, were also from related to this population 37,000 years ago. Is that fair? Is that a reasonable question?
It is actually a reasonable question, and of course, depends how far back you go. You can always relate population. We all
Yeah.
relate back to Africa, of course, but it's actually a reasonable question because we are discussing, in particular, in this topic about West Eurasians that clearly are more similar to each other than East Eurasian, for example. So
Mm.
this genetic ancestry that you described that arrived in Europe during the Neolithic and then also during the Bronze Age are, yes, somehow related to the local hunter-gatherer ancestry, but they are distinct enough through isolation over multiple millennia. So we are able, with ancient DNA, to actually characterize this ancestry and really see when a mixture happens and also estimate the proportion of this admixture. And as you mentioned, from the local, let's say, hunter-gatherer ancestry present in Europe, around 8,000 years ago, there is this spread, most likely from the Near East, of the Neolithic package that is accompanied not only by a spread of knowledge, but clearly a spread of genes, a spread of people, as you mentioned. And also another massive migration, as it has been described, it happens around 5,000 years ago, where it is thought that up to two-thirds of the genetic landscape of Europeans was actually replaced by this movement, most likely from the steppe.
So I'm right in thinking that those are the three sort of major events that have contributed to the genetic makeup of modern Europeans. Those three movements of people, one in the sort of Aurignacian period, later on in the Neolithic, and then the most significant being later on at the start of the Bronze Age.
Well, I have to say that actually, the more we study, the more we discover, of course, with ancient DNA, and we get often many surprises in terms of the population dynamics, both before the Neolithic as well as after the Bronze Age. So clearly, the story is not over with the Bronze Age. There are other substantial population movement that happen after. And
Mm.
right now there is a lack of genetic data from the Iron Age onwards. But I'm sure that with more studies during that time period, we will really discover major population transformation happening even after, let's say, the Bronze Age period. But of course, since the interest of this interview is more towards the earlier time period, you mentioned the Aurignacian, but Aurignacian is only one of the earliest culture associated to modern humans or Homo sapiens in Europe. But throughout time, between 45 or let's say 40,000 to 5,000 years ago, or 7,000 years ago, um, hunter-gatherer population had completely different techno complexes, completely different
Hmm.
industries. I can mention some of the major ones, for example, Gravatian, that is before the last glacial maximum, After the last glacial maximum, you have Magdalenian or Epigravettian, down to the Mesolithic, so before the arrival of the Neolithic expansion. And those people have been also analyzed, and we find a very dynamic change in genetic composition through time. And I will be happy to talk more about that if you are interested about it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what we see is, like you mentioned, origination, and it's we have only very little genetic evidence from this time period, from the very first presence of modern humans, Homo sapiens in Europe. But we have much more data from the Gravettian period, where we see that individuals from the East Europe look very different, for example, from the Aurignacian people from the West. So already you have two very distinct ancestry present before the last glacial maximum. That is the coldest period of the last ice age. So before, just to give a time interval, before 25,000 years ago, there were already very distinct ancestry present in Europe. And then after the last glacial maximum, so let's say after 20,000 years ago, we find that only one type of this ancestry survived. And this ancestry repopulate Europe with a climatic amelioration between 19,000 and 14,000. This ancestry is associated with the Magdalenian complex, Magdalenian industry, and spreads all around Central Europe. And what was a very big surprise of the study from 2016 that we published in Nature, as well as another study that we published in Current Biology looking at the mitochondrial DNA during the same year, we found actually that around 14,000 years ago, there is a population turnover, that it is actually not clearly associated with any clear shift in culture. So it seems to be that at an archaeological level there is continuity, but genetically we find clearly the evidence of shift, a shift and a so-called population replacement. And so this is our aim is, of course, to understand from where these new people arrived in Central Europe, and we have some evidence that these individuals arriving around 14,000 years ago in Central Europe originate from Southeastern Europe, because they carry with them some ancestry related to Near Eastern populations. So this is a movement carrying this ancestry that happens way earlier, so at least 6,000 years old earlier, the Neolithic expansion.
Wow, it's such a powerful tool, the study of ancient genetics. It really is. Like you said, this shift in population that you detected is not associated with any change in material culture. So before the advent of genetics, it would have been impossible to have seen in the archaeological record.
Yeah, I have to say, there were some theories that highlight some differences, but these differences had never taken so much into account, and more like a gradual transformation or a local development of the
Hmm.
or of the culture in Central Europe. Whereas now with ancient genomics, we can really put the spotlight and really give direct evidence of a genetic replacement, and this gives some sort of we are invitation also to colleagues, archaeological colleagues and anthropologists, to look again at the archaeological record and see if subtle differences are actually observed, and maybe assign them, associate them to this population turnover.
Fascinating. It paints such a dynamic picture of prehistory, deep into prehistory, because there's still probably in popular culture the impression that in the ice age, in prehistory, these people were just cavemen, not doing anything, not moving, perhaps not developing in any way, and the picture is so much more dynamic and complicated than that.
Absolutely, absolutely. But we have also to remember, Stefan, one thing that we are talking about at least 30,000 years of human history. So we are talking, and of course, sometimes this time frame it's hard to grasp for us.
Yeah.
We are talking about from 40,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago at least. And during this time period, it's also a period with massive climatic changes. You're going through the ice age. There are really abrupt changes in temperature, in paleo environment, and as the environment change, as the animals and the fauna move, also human moved accordingly. So it's very fascinating to try to link uh, let's say, paleoenvironmental changes with also paleogenetic changes in the genome of both animals as well as humans.
So you can sort of imagine a picture where there are some, like you said, this one expansion of southeastern people from southeastern Europe. You could hypothesize maybe that conditions were more favorable to their way of life as climate changed, and they were able to expand as other groups sort of retreated as their way of life was under threat.
Correct. That's is a very good observation. Actually, it's one of the theory is exactly that one. Is that around 14,000 years ago, there is a very important event that is called boiling Allerud. It's like a warming, very abrupt warming after the last glacial maximum. So it's the first
Mm.
time where there is a spike in increased temperature and, of course, also vegetation changed across Europe. And this probably opened some corridors, some ecological corridors for Homo sapiens, for certain groups that were surviving in isolated region, for example, in some so-called climatic refugia, to actually
Mm.
spread and colonize the rest of Europe.
Fascinating stuff. I love it. Let me ask you another question. In the genetic history of Ice Age Europe paper, am I right in understanding that these earlier populations did not have light skin, pale skin? Is that correct?
Okay, this is a very debated topic, of course, and I'm very happy to talk about that. So, we have first of all to start saying that what we observe in the genome of these individuals by looking at two mutations that are known in modern day Europeans to code for light skin color. So these two mutations are today in Europeans present, and they are responsible for light or pale skin color. When we look at those mutations, when you look at those positions in the genome for ancient hunter-gatherers from Europe, they all carry the ancestral variant, the so-called wild type. Okay,
Mm.
so this indicates, or at least suggests, that this population were indeed having dark skin. However, we need always to put a disclaimer here. Why? Because we are investigating genetic variation that we know about. And we look at those genes, at those positions in the genome, and find that indeed they carry not the derived allele, but the ancestral, so the dark skin color. However, it might be that there are other regions in the genome that we are not aware about that actually were responsible for a lighter coloring of the skin. So we need always to be careful and say, to the limit of our knowledge, those individuals, it's likely that had dark skin, but we cannot exclude that there were other positions in the genome responsible for a light skin.
Interesting. Interesting. I had never thought about it like that. In my naive view of genetics, there would be a place for skin, and they would either have those, traits or not. But I didn't anticipate that we don't know enough about genetics to say whether the other mutations or other genes elsewhere could have produced the same result.
Look, I mean, this is actually not, you're not the only one thinking like that. Actually, most of us, most of geneticists thought that way, thought that indeed skin color is a very simple trait where, there are only one or two or three mutations responsible for this trait. However, more and more you study the genome, for example, there are a lot of studies of the genome of sub-Saharan Africans, and you really realize how um, uh, the skill color is actually a complex trait. So it's so-called polygenic trait. So multiple genes, multiple location of the genome are responsible for the coloring of your skin. So I think we have to be always careful and always leave the door open for the fact that uh, we might discover in the future certain variants that are uh, coding, that are responsible for yeah, the color of the skin in those populations.
Are there any theories as to why we would have maintained dark skin in such cold climates at such high latitudes?
Yeah, so assuming that indeed these early hunter-gatherers were having dark skin, one of the theories is that this population were obviously eating a very meat-rich diet. So they were eating a lot of meat, a lot of animal products, and they would have or absorbed the vitamin D, that of course is very relevant for the formation of our bones, through the consumption of meat. Whereas farming communities that of course were relying much more on a plant-rich diet, they would have benefit much more of having a light skin color, so that the vitamin D would have been absorbed by the solar radiation. So one of the reasons why it's possible that this hunter-gatherer population were dark skin is that they didn't need to evolve a light skin color over millennia, a light skin color over millennia, because of this very meat-rich diet that would provide them with enough resources like vitamin D, that is essential to the formation and to the growth of the bones.
Interesting. And so it's in the Neolithic period that we see the traits evolve for white skin, for pale skin.
Yes. So to be very honest, we identify also already in hunter-gatherer populations, but very late hunter-gatherer population, around 8,000 years ago, the presence of light skin color, mainly in individuals from Eastern Europe, so Eastern European hunter-gatherers. However, the really spike in frequency of these variants that are coding for light skin color is observed during in Neolithic populations. So in populations that are already practicing a farming lifestyle, that then, as we discussed before, around 8,000 years ago, spread from the Near East into Central Europe, bringing with them not only their technology, but also their genes and also this light skin color, and then not mixing with the population that was present in Europe before, so the hunter-gatherer population, and passing on not only the genetic ancestry, but also this trait, this skin trait that then was, of course, selected and maintained into Europe.
Fascinating. That's always a big question for me because I try to produce artwork that paints a picture in people's minds, and picking skin tones for prehistoric populations is something I always struggle with. So that's definitely great for me to learn about.
Yeah, it's very complex, but I think very fascinating. And the more we study, of course, and the more we realize that it's a complex trait, yes. And of course, it was under selection because it's clearly provides some advantages to certain population at a certain time. So now the question is to understand when this is happen and where it happened.
Okie doke. Good to know. Good to know. Let me ask you one other interesting point from that same paper. Is it right that the percentage of our DNA from Neanderthals is decreasing over time?
Yeah, actually, I have to say this analysis has been later disproved
Oh,
by
really?
another study, and I'm happy to talk about that. Is a study that was published, I think, a couple of years after, Peter, 2018, and it was shown that actually there is no clear evidence of this decrease of Neanderthal ancestry through time. So what we can say is that indeed there was a sharp decrease in Neanderthal ancestry after, let's say, the first few thousand years after admixture with Neanderthals, but
Hmm.
then this ancestry is kind of maintained constant from, let's say, 35,000 years ago to today. So this analysis has been corrected in later studies.
It's so interesting to me how much knowledge can change so quickly in all of these things. Um, well, I won't take up any more of your time, Dr. Post. This has been a fascinating reminder of how complicated prehistory and trying to understand prehistory is. I don't have anything else to ask. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing your information with the channel.
Thank you, Stefan, for your question. It was very great pleasure to answer to your question, and I hope it will positively be received by your followers.
They're gonna love it. Don't worry about that. They're gonna absolutely love
Great,
it. They could listen to you talk for about 5 hours, I'm sure. So could I.
great.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you.